Hello and welcome to this episode of Asian World Podcast with Dr. Hawkins. Today we're going to build on our last episode. If you remember last time, we talked a little bit about the phases of colonialism and how the colonized begin to react to increasing oppression. And so today we're going to get a little bit more specific on this episode, and we're going to talk about the rise of something called consciousness, which allows for full resistance to empire. And we're going to look specifically at Southeast Asia. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, there was a massive awakening across colonial Southeast Asia. For nearly 4 centuries, the region had been under Western Empire without a tremendous amount of disruption. There had been rebellions here and there, but by and large, Western Empire had remained fairly constant in the region. But by the end of the 19th century, this was all changing. And it changes primarily due to a rise in what historians refer to as consciousness, or the birth of a historical consciousness. Now, when we talk about consciousness in the past, it's something that's often misunderstood, and students sometimes find it difficult to wrap their heads around. But let me see if I can simplify it. Essentially, what we're talking about when we talk about the rise of consciousness, particularly of the colonized, is this essential and uncanny ability of human beings to step outside of ourselves and behold and comprehend ourselves in the third person. Now, you're more familiar with this than you might think. At the most basic level, for example, we're conscious of our place in space and time. So let me ask you this. Has anybody ever been unconscious? Yeah, I have. I was like 8 hours ago. We all are at some time during a 24-hour day. When you're a kid, were you ever at your grandparents and you're watching some movie and your eyes are so heavy and you can't stave it off anymore and you close them? And then all of a sudden you open your eyes and you look around and there's light outside and you're in your bed and you have no idea how you got there. And so it takes you a minute to orient yourself and say, oh, it's daytime and I'm in my own house and I'm in my own bed. And that state of confusion, what that results from is there was a certain period in which you lost consciousness. You lost your consciousness of your place in space and in time. You don't remember falling asleep. You don't remember your dad gathering you up, putting you in the car, taking you home and putting you in bed. And so during that period, you were unable to step outside yourself in the third person and locate yourself in space and time. So I can do it right now. I can step outside myself and I can see that I'm in a podcast studio. I'm in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm in the United States of America. I'm on planet Earth. I'm in the Milky Way galaxy. I know that it's July 2024. And I can see all those things because I'm able to kind of comprehend myself as if I'm looking at myself. And so I have a consciousness of this. We also have a consciousness of our place in social, cultural, political, and economic contexts. And so we're all really good at this, but I can recite them to you in order on someone's clap. They're easy to recite. I can tell you my gender. I can tell you my race. I can tell you my socioeconomic class. I can tell you my nationality, and I can list them all with a great deal of confidence. But if you pause to think about how something like that can be done, it's really remarkable. It's crazy how human beings are capable of this. This uncanny ability to step outside myself and to see myself in the third person, to see myself as white, to see myself as male, to see myself as American, to see myself as middle age. That's a remarkable ability that only human beings have. And if you think throughout the course of your life when you're a kid, you'll probably remember the moments in which you came to a consciousness of these various things. So some of you may have, as kids, asked your parents, like, are we poor? Right? Are we rich? What is our race? What does that mean? Right? What does it mean to be a boy? What does it mean to be a girl? We ask all these questions so that we can gain a consciousness of ourselves in third person. Well, in terms of empire in Southeast Asia, for the vast majority of colonial history, the colonized are not conscious of the various contexts in which they are located relative to empire. And of course, this is due to the fact that the Southeast Asians outnumber the Westerners by hundreds of thousands, if not millions to one. So under the Western colonial regimes, it was fairly common for the vast majority of the colonized never to behold a European, nor to realize the system of governance under which they reside. However, in the 19th century, this changes, and it changes for a number of reasons, and let me go through them. First, and maybe most importantly, there's an increase in mobility and communication. In the 19th century, the world shrinks dramatically. Through the intervention of steam power, distances become much, much shorter, and the time it takes to travel to disparate parts of the world is dramatically smaller than it was just decades before. We also have the advent of telegraphs and eventually telephones, which allow nearly instantaneous communication. And what this means for humanity, but particularly for the colonized, is for the first time in history, people could have sustained contact with others that were different than them. So prior to the shrinking of the world, and you and I lived in a little village in Sulawesi or in Borneo, it was likely that unless we were wayfinders, unless we were seafarers, we probably wouldn't travel 100 miles beyond where we were born. And more than likely, all the people that we would encounter would be very, very similar to us, sharing very close ethno-linguistic similarities, cultural understandings, ways of living and inhabiting the world. All of that would seem homogenous, and we would naturally assume that the rest of the world simply lives the way that we live. It was once pointed out that if I were to go to the Dutch East Indies 400 years ago, and I was to tell the people residing there, you see that puddle of water? I have a way to congeal that water into a solid mass, so much so that you could stand on it. They would look at me like I was talking craziness. But of course, all I'm talking about is ice. But for someone who has never encountered these things, you assume that your world is the world entire. But suddenly in the 19th century, as the world shrinks, more and more people come into contact with those that are not like them. And this is the magical moment. I mean, fish don't know they're wet. But the moment I encounter someone who is not like me, it provokes that inevitable and quintessential human question. What are you? Why are you different than me? And the question that closely follows is even more critical. What am I? If everyone in the world is not like me, then what am I? You don't have to name the things for which there is no difference. We just call that the world. But once we encounter difference, suddenly I need to become conscious of what I am relative to things that I am not. And again, that magical moment where I have to step outside myself and I have to look at the disparity. I have to behold it in third person. I have to say, here's me and here's this other person. And we have differences. What are the differences and why do they exist? We also have to engage in a kind of valuative assessment. Well, here's what I am and here's what they are. Which one is more beneficial or which one is better? And this is kind of the quintessential human response. And this is what begins to happen across Southeast Asia as the colonized begin moving with much greater ease. It's particularly acute in the urban areas. So again, if we lived in the Dutch East Indies and we resided in a village way off in the interior, and then suddenly we make a trip to Yogyakarta or we make a trip to Batavia, and suddenly we're encountering a sea of people that are not like me. Whereas before my identity was bound up in my own ethno-linguistic culture, now I'm encountering people that are not me. Not me a little bit and not me a lot. And so when I get to these urban areas, I start to see others that will later in history be termed as Indonesians or Filipinos or Malaysians. And even though we differ ethno-linguistically, I start to see that we share an experience as the colonized. And so I tend to notice that the cities are segregated and the Dutch live over in that side of the city. And people like me, even though we have different culture or ethno-linguistic identity, we live in this part of the town. Why is that? What are the experiences and identities and similarities that create this segregated state of affairs? And naturally, we notice, where does power reside? Where does wealth reside? Where does access and opportunity and all the good things reside? And where is poverty? Where is difficulty? And as I sort through these experiences, I and others like me, members of the colonized, begin to gain a consciousness of this experience called empire. Now, a lot of times this begins to morph racially because the easiest way to identify, well, what people live in that part of town and what people live in this part of town is by the tone of their skin or their hair or their eye color. And so it's the most easily identifiable marker of those with power in this part of town or those with opportunity and those in this part of town. And so they begin to get a shared consciousness, not only of the experience, but of their bodies, of their context. They're able to step outside of themselves in the third person, and they're able to look at the situation, and they begin to understand empire. Now, this increased mobility and communication then develops into a phase known as print capitalism. As the colonized begin to understand their place within the hierarchy of empire, They naturally want to share their experiences. This eventually develops into the rise of vernacular newspapers, meaning that the colonized are writing about their experiences in their own vernacular language and within a cultural context that they can understand. This is the moment when empire begins to erode. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to name your oppression. If you don't have a name for what's hurting you, then you live in a state of frustration. You might say to yourself, oh my gosh, life is hard. Why does life have to suck? Why is everything so difficult? And then suddenly you get a consciousness that allows you to name your oppression. So you can say, oh, my life sucks because of inflation, because of social strife, because of political corruption, or in the case of the colonized, because of empire. Once I can name my oppression, once I can diagnose the problem, then I can begin to compartmentalize it and I can begin to attack it. This is incredibly empowering and incredibly therapeutic. Even think on a personal level. I know people that don't feel well. They're kind of sick, they're kind of not sick, and they just want to know what's wrong. And at last, if they can get a specialist to diagnose whatever the problem is, a vitamin deficiency or a parasite or whatever it might be, then half of the anxiety is gone. Now they know what the problem is. They can name the problem. They can attack the problem that make their life so difficult. And so in the 19th century, when we get the rise of indigenous newspapers written in the vernacular, the colonized developed their own language of resistance. They're naming the causes of their oppression and they're discussing what to do about it. But print capitalism has another side effect as well. This one I think is most interesting. It is called print capitalism because the periodicals are sold. Therefore, they must be hyper-responsive to the desires and tastes of the masses, meaning I need to publish what people want to hear. That means that the newspapers and the periodicals must reflect popular themes, values, aspirations, fears, and this shared consumption of print capitalism leads to a proto-nationalist consciousness. There's a great author, kind of a literary hero of mine named Benedict Anderson, and he wrote this book many, many years ago called Imagine Communities. And it talks about nationalism. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this weird phenomenon called nationalism. If you really sit and ponder it, it's kind of crazy that something like this exists. That there is this metaphysical, almost spiritual connection shared among a group of people who don't even know each other. And you've all experienced this. So for example, if an airplane goes down and the news reports it, what's the first thing we want to know? How many Americans on board? If there's a terrorist attack in some part of the world, what's the first thing we want to know? How many Americans died? Why? Why do I want to know that? I don't know those people. Why do I care any more about the Americans that died than the Tunisians that went down in the plane crash? Or the Thais, or the Malaysians, or the Japanese, or the Saudis? We're all human beings. Why should I have a greater affinity to the number of Americans that went down? But again, we all experience this. I mean, let's say in this studio, suddenly a guy walks in, he's Austrian, and him and we're just alike. He loves to travel. He loves Southeast Asia. He's a scholar. He loves to write. Everything that I like, he likes. And I say, buddy, you and I are going to hang out. We're going to have a ton of fun together. All right. I like you. But as much as I like you and as good of friends as we're going to be, in a really weird, fundamental way, you're not my people. We're never going to understand each other at a deep, deep fundamental level. And the reason we're not is because we don't have the same deep down, whatever this metaphysical thing is that unites us. Same thing. So another guy walks in, right? And he's from Arkansas, and we don't like any of the same things. He doesn't like to read. He's not into travel. He wants to do other things. And he likes the band Styx, which I can't stand. And I'm like, you know what, buddy? You and I have nothing in common. If we were on a road trip, I don't know what we talk about. But at the end of the day, you're my people somehow, you know? You understand me and I understand you in an almost metaphysical way. If you've ever traveled, you'd probably experience this. That you're in a foreign country, even if it's a place that speaks English. You could be in London, for heaven's sake, and all of a sudden you're at a cafe and you meet another person from where you're from, right? So in my case, you meet an American and you strike up this conversation, and immediately there's a sense of unconscious recognition, a sense of comfort that all of your references, all of the things you talk about, there's just a fundamental mutual understanding. And there's something deep inside you, whether you like the person or not, that says, this is my people, and you kind of recognize it. Well, how does such a thing come about? Well, Benedict Anderson, in his book Imagine Communities, writes about this phenomenon of print capitalism. And essentially, the effect of print capitalism is that when we all share stories, when we all share symbols, when we all share narratives and heroes and villains and values, and when these things are inscribed upon us through popular common consumption of popular literary culture or mass media culture, we develop an unspoken kinship. We develop an understanding that goes beyond shared space or political systems. When we're consuming the same stories, the same narratives, the same heroes and villains and values, we begin to forge an unconscious understanding of each other. That we're all kind of on this journey together. Now, if you want to do a little experiment, you want to try to experience this consciously, right? Where you can step outside yourself and you can see yourself experiencing this. Try this. Take a popular series, a popular movie, a popular book, pause for a moment and deeply ponder. Why am I rooting for the protagonist? And why am I rooting against the antagonist? At the surface level, you might tell yourself, well, it's easy. It's a question of good and evil. It's a question of heroes and villains. But that's not always the case. As a matter of fact, we don't enjoy those kinds of stories that are black and white and binary. Asking yourself why you root for a protagonist and why you root against an antagonist is a deeply revealing question. And it often exposes our shared values. I'll give you a fantastic example. Now, don't judge me too much. But I think possibly the greatest series ever written, directed, produced, acted in, distributed, any level, is an AMC series called Breaking Bad. I think it's fantastic from season 1 to the end, whatever season that is. I think it is so fantastic, so well done, so gritty and real and compelling and Shakespearean. Yeah, watching Breaking Bad produces internal conflicts. And if you've seen it, you've experienced this conflict, that you're watching it, you're so compelled. But then there comes a moment, even in season 1, but definitely by season 2, that you have to sit back and ask yourself an honest question. Why am I, a generally good person, rooting for a middle-aged meth dealer who's poisoning his community, slowly being corrupted by the process and becoming more greedy and more evil? And yet every single episode, every single season, I want Walt to win. And so I'm deeply invested in Walter White's character. I want him to win. But that's crazy. Why don't I root for his brother-in-law, Hank? I mean, after all, he is a member of the establishment of law and order. He's trying to protect the community. He's trying to diminish crime and diminish drug abuse. I don't want him to win. I don't want Hank to win. I want Walt to win. Why? What is the matter with me? Why am I rooting for Walter White in Breaking Bad? Well, think about this analytically. What is Walter White symbolically? What would cause us to root for him? Well, Walter White embodies all of the classic American frontier values that are inscribed upon us, whether you agree with them or not. So think about it. It's not a coincidence that Breaking Bad is set in New Mexico, out on the American frontier. And it's not a coincidence either that Vince Gilligan has these grand vistas of the New Mexican desert. And if you've seen the series, you know what I'm talking about. Just absolutely beautiful. You have the desert and it's like a panoramic shot, and you have the cloud shadows rolling over the dry desert. That is the American frontier. And it's an image that we all recognize. Breaking Bad, if nothing else, is a story of a man reclaiming his frontier masculinity. And I'd refer you to the work of Gail Biederman and Kirsten Hoganson on some of this in 19th century American masculinity. But if you think about Breaking Bad, that's what the story is. And they're not shy about it. And if you look at the first season, Walter White is easily the most emasculated man in America. He's a genius, but his students don't respect him. He's forced to work a demeaning job at the car wash because his salary doesn't make ends meet. He's expecting a baby. His students make fun of him while he's washing cars. His wife bosses him around. His brother-in-law humiliates him. Walt is the quintessential doormat. People just walk on him like a rug. But as Walter White begins making his own way in the world, as he begins making things happen for himself, again, the way Vince Gilligan wrote it is Walter White is reclaiming his masculinity. And there's a couple of important scenes in the series that talk about this. When he's talking to Fring and he's having doubts, Fring kind of grabs him almost in this macho moment and says, look, if there's anything that a man does, a man provides by any means necessary. A man provides for his family. And that's exactly what Walt does, is he makes a way to provide. He makes a way to pay for his cancer treatments. He makes a way to take care of his family, even at the end of the series. Of course, there's the other scene that she's ashamed to say you enjoy, but there's that moment where Jesse's going to face those two drug dealers and he's going to get smoked. And nevertheless, he's going because of the thing that they did. And as the moment of encounter approaches, Walt rolls up in an SUV and boom, runs over the two guys, shoots the guy in the head, hops out of the car and says, run. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, that was incredible. That was awesome. And then common sense sinks in. You go, no, Mike, that wasn't awesome. He ran over two people and he shot somebody. That's bad. Okay, that's bad. You don't ever want to be in a situation where you do that, and you don't want to see that happen in your society. And yet there's something about him taking charge of the situation. Again, whatever you think about masculinity, whether you think it's great or you think it's toxic, you find yourself rooting for Walter White because of these unconscious American values that are inscribed on you through 1,000 books and 1,000 series and 1,000 movies. Another reason people love Breaking Bad is it's the classic story of American entrepreneurship. I mean, I tell my students that are business majors, if nothing else, Breaking Bad is a series about business. I mean, that's all the series is Walt has to systematically overcome a series of logistical problems relative to his business. And so he has to think about supply. He has to think about production. He has to think about distribution. He has to think about balance sheets. He has to think about marketing. He has to think about all of the classic elements of American business are there. He's just working outside the system. But for anyone who has been inscribed with the American value of entrepreneurship, the American dream of creating a marketable and sustainable and successful business, Walt achieves that American dream. Now, he achieves it outside the system, but that's also the reason people like it. It's often been said that the only organic American philosophical school is pragmatism. That's just essentially American. That if it works, keep it. If it doesn't work, get rid of it. And if you can't make it work, you got to find your own way to make it work. And so Walt's life was not working. His school teacher life was not working. His car wash life was not working. His health insurance was not working. And so Walt made his own way, and Americans deeply admire that. And so it's a story about rugged individualism, frontier values, masculinity, entrepreneurship. And again, whether you agree with these American values or not, the interesting exercise is to watch Breaking Bad and see if you root for Walt. And if you do, you agree with them at some level, or at least they're inscribed on you in a way that you're participating in this national consciousness. And it's things like that that foster recognition, that make somebody walk in a room and me say, yeah, he's my people. She's my people. We understand these unconscious shared values that are inscribed upon us through print capitalism. And so the shared recognition comes from shared stories, shared narratives, shared values. And this is exactly what happens in Southeast Asia with the rise of print capitalism in vernacular languages. Second, we get the rise in consciousness because of the education of native elites. Now, within empire across the region, by the 19th century, the ultimate dream of the colonized is to go get educated in the metropole. So you can go to London, you can go to Paris, you can go to Harvard, you get a degree. And if you have the degree, you can come back and work in the colonial regime as a subsidiary. And so you kind of get a lifetime access to power, a lifetime access to wealth, and you provide a bridge, kind of like my reading a couple episodes ago on Cartini, between the colonizer and the colonized. Now, this is a policy that the imperialists advocate. So you pick out the talented, intelligent members of the colonized, and you have them go off and acculturate to the metropole in universities. And so you give them education in Western civilization and accounting and law and whatever. Gandhi does this, Jose Rizal does this, Ho Chi Minh does this. Go off, get educated in the ways of the metropole, then come back to the colony and participate in the maintenance of empire. However, this policy is a double-edged sword, and it really risks one of the overlooked keys of imperial dominance, something I don't think is written about enough. And it's known as the myth of the metropole. And when we take a deep critical look at empire, empire is such a fragile thing. It's built upon such fragile foundations. And every once in a while, you get a piece that really reveals this. If you haven't read it, go read George Orwell's Killing an Elephant. And it's just brilliant. I mean, he's a policeman in Burma, and he talks about how he has to shoot this elephant. He's really bullied into it by the local population. And you come away from it realizing that the British aren't in charge of anything, right? They're just there. And they're being used and manipulated in a variety of ways. But the myth of the metropole is one of these fragile foundations. And the myth of the metropole goes something like this. In the metropole, so in the United States, in Holland, in France, in England, everything is wonderful. It's just a paradise. Everyone has enough to eat. The streets are clean. Everyone is educated and civilized. It's a marvel of modern industry. Employment is full. Everything smells good. The food tastes good. Everything works. Everything is efficient. Everything is comfortable. And the imperialists say, I left that to condescend and come here to the colonies, where everything is dirty and everything is uncomfortable and everything is savage and inefficient and backward and archaic. But I do it because it's the right thing to do, because civilization must be spread. And so the empires are built upon this disparity, this sort of mythic notion that the metropole is paradise and the colony is hell. And of course, it produces this horrible sense of inadequacy among the colonized, which is actively fostered by the imperialist. I mean, think about the moral authority you have to go to someplace in the world and say, I'm here to civilize you. I mean, you must have one heck of a sense of moral authority and superiority to even make that statement. And so the moral authority of empire rests upon this myth of the metropole. Now, one of the horrible side effects is that it often teaches the indigenous to hate their own culture, to look down on native institutions and practices. But it's actively fostered by the imperialists because it definitely helps sustain empire. Again, a couple readings ago, if you want to go listen to my piece on Cartini, she really struggles with this. But at the end, it's a myth. It's not true. And often when these native elites go abroad to be educated in the metropole, they're shocked. They're shocked and horrified because the myth bursts. And so the elites traveling to the metropole is often the beginning of a process known as demythologizing the metropole, where you take the myth of the metropole and you begin to tear it down. And it's really fun to go back and read their letters. So the elites from Southeast Asia would send their children off, and the children go off and study in London or in New York or wherever. And even though they're overcome by the awe of the grand industrial modernity in the metropole, you'll quickly see in their letters that they don't like it. So they'll write in their letters and say, look, the sun never freaking shines here. The weather is always bad. It's cold, it's smoky, it's terrible, it's slushy. Oh, what I wouldn't give for a little bit of sunshine. They also write about the conditions in the urban areas, and they say it's filthy here. There's garbage everywhere. New York's buried in horse crap. Soot covers everything in London. It's filthy. The streets are also filled with social strife. We see homeless people. We see labor strikes. We see fist fights. We see saloon culture. We see prostitutes. All of the things they told us weren't here are here. And I'm sure the parents on the other end are saying, are you sure you're in the right place? Are you sure you arrived in London? Or are you sure you arrived in New York? But suddenly these native elites, even though they're there ostensibly for the purpose of becoming subsidiaries of the empire to go back and impose and maintain Western empire on their own people, they're seeing the myth of the metropole. And they realize that the great disparity that the imperialists talked about does not exist. But then something else begins to happen. As they're abroad, they begin to unite with each other. They gain a consciousness of who and what they are. So Gandhi, for example, is a great example. When he went off to London, his parents were extremely worried, and they thought, Number one, don't go to London. You're not going to be able to live a good Hindu life there. And number two, don't go to London because they may teach you to hate your own people. Well, on the first count, his parents were dead wrong. When Gandhi gets to London, he becomes more Hindu than he's ever been. The reason is because he goes to London and he meets with other Hindu Indians. And they fundamentalize their identity because they suddenly gain a consciousness of it relative to the sea of people that are not Hindu. And so these Southeast Asian elites come together and they begin to hone and refine and sharpen their identities, particularly in the things that they write. Jose Rizal is a great example, the great Filipino patriot. When he goes abroad, it's in Spain and Germany that he writes his great novels, No Limitangri and El Filibusterismo, that spark a revolution in the Philippines. Why? Because he's gaining this consciousness of who he is, what kind of person he is, and a third person relative to the context of empire. And as they begin to write in this state of consciousness, they start to get romantically nostalgic. Now, at first, this is the kind of nostalgia that everybody who's traveled experiences. So they say, oh, look, I miss my mama. I miss my dog. I miss the family. I miss, Sunday dinner. But then it becomes more abstract. And they start to write things like, I miss the way that the land smells after the monsoons. And I miss watching the sun set over the South China Sea. I miss my land. And I miss my people. And this is not where I belong. I belong over there and I belong with them. Now, when people start talking like that, you know what we call it? We call that nationalism. This unspoken, metaphysical, almost spiritual connection to a place, to a people that's shared among you and them and not other people. The way that somebody walk in the door, you look at them, you talk to them, you say, you know what, you're my people. And I can't tell you why, but you are. This begins to develop among these elites. And as I said earlier, we have dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of examples of those that go abroad and then they come back. So again, Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, Jose Rizal, and others, Sun Yat-sen. And they're the ones that eventually become the nationalist leaders. Third, as these native elites go abroad, they experience liberal anti-colonial ideas in the West. Another aspect of the myth of the metropole was that the colonizers were in lockstep regarding empire. So what they would tell the colonized, especially in the 19th and 20th century, is that empire is inevitable. The superior people of the metropole are unanimous in their consent of empire as a means to uplift and civilize the rest of the world. You couldn't stop what's coming for you. This is inevitably the course of fate of all humanity. However, when the native elites get to the metropole, suddenly they discover there are huge portions of the metropolitan population that hate empire. Anti-imperialism is a huge political movement across Europe, across the United States, and most imperial countries. And of course, when the native elites show up, these anti-imperialist organizations invite them as guests of honor to give speeches, to have dinners, and they arm them most importantly with the tools to resist empire. And so they give them all kinds of literature on how to use the bureaucracy and how to use economics, how to use the court systems against empire. They fund them. So they take up collections from those who don't agree with empire or feel it's immoral, and they try to empower the colonized to resist. And so another side effect of bringing the native elites to the metropole to get educated is not only that the metropole begins to become demythologized because of simply what it is, but it's also demythologized in the sense that empire is actually the aim of perhaps a minority of the population in the metropole. That there are a great many people who feel that it's immoral and that are ready to arm you with the rhetoric and the tools and the funds to take the system down. Number 4, Chinese nationalism. As we get into the 20th century, Dr. Sun Yat-sen begins to travel around the diaspora. Sun Yat-sen was an absolute genius. He's one of my favorite people. And so he travels throughout the Chinese communities in Southeast Asia and really around the world. And he's preaching a constant sermon of nationalism, nation state, self-determination. And Sun Yat-sen is a source of great inspiration, particularly for the Chinese communities throughout Southeast Asia, which excites nationalist movements across the region. And again, if you look back, many of the nationalist leaders in Southeast Asia are of some portion of Chinese descent. And so the infusion of nationalist ideas, particularly from Sun Yat-sen, but others, really kind of excites this in Southeast Asia. Number 6, statistics and bureaucracy. So everything I talked about in Orientalism Part 2 with the colonial census and taxonomizing and surveilling populations really reaches its apex in Southeast Asia. So everything I talked about in India times it by 10 in Southeast Asia. So by the time this occurs in Southeast Asia, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, the Western imperialists have perfected scientific race making. And so every aspect of the Southeast Asians' physical and cultural existence was scientifically quantified and documented. For a great case study on this, look at the career of Dean Worcester in the Philippines. There's also a tremendous amount of literature on Dutch phrenologists and others going into the hinterlands of the Dutch East Indies, and they bring with them calipers to measure cranial size and eye color charts and skin color charts, and they take hair samples and it's look at the webbing in between toes. It's completely creepy. But they're trying to scientifically quantify people. Paul Kramer's done some great work on this as well with race making in the Philippines. But like the other things that we've talked about today, this practice is a double-edged sword. While taxonomizing the population in a colonial census and in ethnology reports and in scientific journals is a way of surveillance and control, it also gives the colonized a tool that you wouldn't expect. It gives them a manufactured basis for organization and resistance. So whereas prior to the taxonomization of the population, the people may not have an organizing principle. So even though we all are quote unquote Indonesian or Filipino, we do have these ethno-linguistic differences, and it's tough to align our interests. But if you lump me in a homogenous category with other people, suddenly now I have a name for our organization. I have a means of organizing my taxonomy. And so statistics and bureaucracy really give a tool to the colonized to use as an organizing principle against empire. Now, the great tragedy is when empire leaves, these taxonomies begin to fight each other. And we talked a little bit about that in Orientalism Part 2. But it does provide a kind of consciousness and an organizing principle against empire. And finally, number 7. Number 7 comes in the 20th century with the conquest of Southeast Asia by the Japanese Imperial Army. And I have trouble really conveying this to my students, but the rapidity and the absolute brutality with which the Japanese overcome Western Empire in Southeast Asia is epic, unparalleled. Within 7 weeks, the Japanese Imperial Army sweeps over 400 years of Western Empire off the map in Southeast Asia as if by the hand of God. 4 centuries of Western Empire is wiped away. And not only do they wipe away Western Empire, but they routinely humiliate the Western imperialists. So if you've seen the movie Unbroken about the fall of Singapore, or if you've ever read about the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, where Filipinos and Americans were forced to march and tortured and murdered. And so the West is humiliated. Now, this act of conquest by the Japanese is the definitive and final act of demythologizing the West. After Western Empire falls to the Japanese, it can never come back in the same way as it did. It's just not possible. Now, Japanese success, ironically, had been a tool that the Westerners had used to bludgeon Southeast Asians in the 19th century. So after the Meiji Restoration in 1868 in Japan, the Meiji regime fully westernizes. So they drop all of their traditional Japanese culture. They industrialize like the West, educate like the West, organize the military like the West. They take off their robes, cut off their top knots, put on 3-piece suits, wear bowler hats and watches with chains, and they fully westernize. Now, when they do, Meiji Japan performs a miracle. They become a modern first-class industrial nation in 50 years. It's amazing what they accomplished. Now, at the time, by the time we get to the early 20th century, the Americans go to the Southeast Asians and they say, do you see? You see? Huh? Everything we've told you is true. Look at the Japanese. I told you if you walk like us, talk like us, work like us, live like us, get educated like us, you too can overcome your archaic savagery and become modern first-class people. And so the Japanese seem to be this vindication of everything the West believed about itself. Now, for the Southeast Asians, though, that's not what they heard. They didn't hear any of that. What they heard and what they saw is, oh, here's an Asian nation, an Asian people that have learned to overcome the West. And when the Japanese wipe out the West and Southeast Asia, that's it. Empire has been demythologized and it can't come back. The fragile foundations are no longer tenable. But Japanese invasion also has another effect. Now, when the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia, they came with all this soaring rhetoric of Asia for the Asians, the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. The Japanese in the Philippines, for example, had all these propaganda posters of benevolent Japanese soldiers with their arms around children, liberating Asians from the evils of Western empire. And so it was supposed to be this great moral liberation. But in the end, Japanese empire in Southeast Asia was as bad or worse than Western empire ever was by a factor of 10. When the Japanese arrive in the region, they immediately begin to loot, to mass murder civilians. They round up hundreds of thousands in old school chattel slavery. So in chains, in irons, forcing them as slaves to work on projects for the war until they work them to death. And so hundreds of thousands more die as a result of slavery. But the Japanese also become incredibly intimate in their brutality. And some things are unspeakable. And for many Southeast Asians, unforgivable. After the rape of Nanjing, which is a lecture for another day, the Japanese Imperial Army felt that they didn't want such an atrocity to occur again, but they felt that the Japanese soldiers, under the stress of battle and the war, needed a sexual outlet. And so the policy they arrived at was something known as comfort stations. And a comfort station was essentially a sex slave camp all over the empire. So they had them in Korea, they had them in China, but they had a great deal of them in Southeast Asia. And it is such a horrific thing. It's difficult to talk about, but essentially what the Japanese did was they rounded up sex slaves anywhere from the ages of 9 to 60. And they put them in these comfort stations, and they were known as comfort women. And they were forced to sexually service 25 to 30 Japanese soldiers a day. When they weren't being raped, they were employed as domestic servants, doing laundry and cooking food. And the stories will bring tears to your eyes. There's a book, which I recommend with caution. It's written by a Filipina. It's called A Comfort Woman. And she talks about her experiences in these Japanese comfort stations. And it is so horrible. It's hard to imagine that level of suffering and that level of inhumanity. And the Japanese exploitation and abuse and atrocities and crimes committed in Southeast Asia will echo throughout all of history. But this teaches the Southeast Asians something. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your race is. Doesn't matter what your soaring rhetoric is, or your moral rationales, or your propaganda, or your underlying reasons, or your motives. Empire is empire is empire. And empire means oppression, suffering, murder, rape, humiliation, and destruction. And there are several groups of people in Southeast Asia that in that moment say, we will never accept it again, ever. If we have to fight to the last man, woman, and child, we will never accept empire again. And of course, the classic example of this is Indochina. So the French come back after the war. Again, this lecture for another day. But the French come back after the war, and the Vietnamese fight them. The Americans come, the Vietnamese fight them. In 1979, the Vietnamese go to war with the Chinese, which most people don't know. Now, we view these as separate conflicts, but for the Vietnamese, this is one continuous anti-colonial struggle. And in that moment, during the Second World War, where Ho Chi Minh comes back and forms the Viet Minh and fights against the Japanese, the Vietnamese people decide, we will never accept this again, ever. And that becomes the end of empire in Southeast Asia. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Asian World Podcast with Dr. Hawkins. If you'd like to support this podcast, please see the link below. Also, please check out my other published works, including an audio version of Making Moros. Thanks, and see you next time.